Not quite sure when this was written, but the guy who wrote it, Grassic Gibbon, was alive between 1901 and 1935. It's called Glasgow. Glasgow is one of the few places in Scotland which defy personification. To image Edinburgh as a disappointed spinster with a hare lip and inhibitions is at least to approximate as closely to the truth as to image the prime mover as a Levantine Semite. So with Dundee, a frowsy fisherwife addicted to gin and infanticide. Aberdeen, a thin-lipped peasant woman who was born 11 and buried 9. But no Scottish image of personification may display, even distortedly, the essential Glasgow. One might go further afield to the tortured imaginings of the Asiatic mind to find her likeness. Many-armed Siva, with the waistlet of skulls, or Xippy of ancient America, whose priest skinned the victim alive and clad himself in the victim's skin. But one doubts anthropomorphic representation at all. The monster of Loch Ness is probably the lost soul of Glasgow, in scales and horns, disporting itself in the Highlands after evacuating finally and completely its mother corpse. One cannot blame it. My distant cousin, Mr. Leslie Mitchell, once described Glasgow in one of his novels as the vomit of a cataleptic commercialism. But it is more than that. It may be a corpse, but the maggots swarm upon it is a ferry fiercely alive. One cannot watch and hear the long beat of traffic down Sauchiehall, or see its eddy and spume where St. Vincent Street and Renfield Street cross, without realising what excellent grounds the old-fashioned anthropologist appeared to have for believing that man was by nature a brutish savage, a herd beast delighting in vocal discordance and orgiastic oral abandon. Loch Lomond lies quite near to Glasgow. Nice Glaswegians motor out there and admire the scenery and calculate its horsepower and drink whisky and chaff one another on genteelly anglicised Glaswegianisms. After a hasty look at Glasgow, the investigator would do well to disguise himself as one of like kind, drive down to Loch Lomond side and stare across its waters at the sailing clouds that crown the Ben, at the flooding of colours changing and darkling and miraculously lighting up and down those misty slopes, where night comes over long mountain leagues that know only the paddings of the shy stray hare, the whir and cry of the startled pheasant. Silence is so deep you can hear the moon come up, mornings so greyly coloured they seem stolen from Norse myth. This is the proper land and stance from which to look at Glasgow, to divest oneself of horror or shame or admiration or very real fear and ask, why? Why did men ever allow themselves to become enslaved to a thing so obscene and so foul when there was this awaiting them? Hills and splendours of freedom and silence, the clean splendours of hunger and woe and dread in the winds and rains and famine times of the earth, hunting and love and the call of the moon. Nothing endured by the primitives who once roamed those hills. Nothing of woe or terror approximated in degree or kind to that life that festers in the courts and wines and alleys of Camlachie governed the Gorbals. In Glasgow, there are over 150,000 human beings living in such conditions as the most bitterly pressed primitive in Tierra del Fuego never visioned. They live 5 or 6 to the single room, and at this point, sitting and staring at Ben Lomond, it requires a vivid mental jerk to realise the quality of that room. It is not a room in a large and airy building. It is not a single-roomed hut on the verge of a hill. It is not a cave driven into free rock in the sound of the seabirds as that old Azulian cave in Argyll. It is a room that is part of some great sloven of tenement, the tenement itself in a line or grouping with hundreds of its fellows, its windows grimed with the unceasing wash and drift of coal dust, its stairs narrow and befouled and steep, its evening breath like that which might issue from the mouth of a lung-diseased beast. The 150,000 eat and sleep and copulate and conceive and crawl into childhood in those waste jungles of stench and disease and hopelessness, subhumans as definitely as the Morlocks of Wales, and without even the consolation of feeding on their oppressor's flesh. 150,000, and all very like you or me or my investigator sitting appalled on the banks of Loch Lomond, where he and his true love will never meet again. And they live on food of the quality of offal, ill-cooked, ill-eaten, with speedily diseased teeth, for the tending of which they can afford no fees. They work, if they have work, in factories or foundries or the roaring reek of the docks, toilsome and dreary, unimaginative hours, hour on hour, day on day, frittering away the tissues of their bodies, and the spirit stuff of their souls. They are workless, great numbers of them, doomed to long days of staring vacuity, of shoelessness, of shivering hidings in this and that runway when the landlord's agents come, of mean and desperate beggings at labour exchanges and public assistance committees. Their voices are the voices of men and women robbed of manhood and womanhood. The investigator on Loch Lomond's side shudders and turns to culture for comfort. He is, of course, a subscriber to the modern Scot, where culture at free removes. Castrated, disembowelled, and genteelly vulgarised. He is served afresh each season and has brought his copy with him. Mr. Adam Kennedy is serialising a novel, The Mourners. His technique, a genteel objectivity, and one of his characters has stopped in Glasgow's Kelvin Grove and is savouring its essence. John's eyes savoured the spaciousness of the crescent, the formal curve of the unbroken line of house facades, the regimentation of the rows of chimney pots, the full-length windows, the unnecessarily broad front steps, the feudal basements, savoured all these in the shimmering heat of the day, just as his nose had savoured the morning freshness. It was as good for him to walk round these old terraces as to visit a cathedral. He could imagine now and then that he had evoked for himself something of the atmosphere of the grand days of these streets. The world was sure of itself then, sure of the ultimate perfectibility of man, sure of the ultimate mastery over the forces that surrounded him. And if Atlas then no longer had the world firm on his shoulder, the world, for all that rested on the same basis of the fuss and fussness of things. With such a basis, you could have that sureness of yourself to do things largely as had been done before, but the modern mind was no longer sure of itself even in a four-roomed bungalow. Its pride was the splitting of its personality into broods of impish devils that spent their time spying on one another. It could never get properly outside itself, could never achieve the objectivity that was capable of such grandly deliberate planning as in these streets. Glasgow speaks. The 150,000 are answered. Glasgow has spoken. This indeed is its attitude, not merely a pale way of intellectualism peculiar to the modern Scot. The bourgeois Glaswegian cultivates aesthetic objectivity as happier men cultivate beards or gardens. Pleasant folk of Kelvin Grove point out that those 150,000, how well off they are, free education, low rents, no rates, state relief, half of them in fact, state pensioners. Besides, they enjoy life as they are, damn them, or they ought to, always raising riots about their conditions, not that they raise the riots themselves, it's the work of the communists, paid agitators from Moscow, but they've long since lost all hold, or they ought to have. In those days of nationalism, or Douglasism, that ingenious scheme for childbirth without plan and, even more intriguing, without a child, of socialism, of fascism, Glasgow, as no other place moves me to a statement of faith. I have amused myself with many political creeds. The more egregious the creed, the better. I have amused myself with many political creeds. The more egregious the creed, the better. I like the thoughts of a Scots Republic with Scots border guards in saffron kilts. The thought of those kilts can awake me to joy in the middle of the night. I like the thought of Miss Wendy Wood leading a Scots expeditionary force down to Westminster to reclaim the Scone Stone. I would certainly march with that expedition myself in spite of the risk of dying of laughter, by the way. I like the thoughts of a Scots Catholic kingdom with Mr. Compton Mackenzie Prime Minister to some disinherited Jacobite royalty, and all the Scots intellectuals settled out on the land on 30-acre crofts or sent to recolonise St Kilda for the good of their souls. and the nation, except the hundreds streaming over the border in panic flight at sight of the Scotland of their dreams. I like the thought of the ancient Scots aristocracy revived and set in order by Mr. George Blake, that epor of the people. Mr. Blake vetoing the Duke of Montrose is one of my dearest visions. I like the thoughts of the Scottish fascists evicting all those of Irish blood from Scotland, and so leaving Albin entirely deserted out for some half-dozen pro-Irish Picts like myself. I like the thought of a Scottish Socialist Republic under Mr. Maxton, preferably at war with Royalist England, and Mr. Maxton summoning the Russian Red Army to his aid, the Red Army digging a secret tunnel from Archangel to Aberdeen, and I like the thought of Mr. R.M. Black and his mysterious Free Scots, that modern mafia assassinating the bankers, which is what bankers are for. But I cannot play with those fantasies when I think of the 150,000 in Glasgow. They are something that stills the parlour chatter. I find I am, by way of being an intellectual myself, I meet and talk with many people whose interests are art and letters and music, enthusiasm for this and that aspect of craft and architecture, men and women who have very warm and sincere beliefs indeed regarding the ancient culture of Scotland, people to whom Glasgow is the Hunterian Museum with its fine array of Roman coins, or the galleries with their equally fine array of pictures. Culture is the motif word of the conversation. Ancient Scots culture, future Scots culture, culture ad lib and ad nauseam. The patter is as intimate on my tongue as on theirs, and relevant to the fate and being of those 150,000, it is no more than the chatter and scratch of a band of apes seated in a pit on a midden of corpses. There is nothing in culture or art that is worth the life and elementary happiness of one of those thousands who rot in the Glasgow slums. There is nothing in science or religion. If it came, as it may come, to some fantastic choice between a free and independent Scotland, centre of culture, a bright flame of artistic and scientific achievement, and providing elementary decencies of food and shelter to the submerged proletariat of Glasgow and Scotland, I would at least have no doubt as to which side of the battle I would range myself. For the cleansing of that horror, if cleanse it they could, I would welcome the English in suzerainty over Scotland till the end of time. I would welcome the end of braid Scots and Gaelic, our culture, our history, our nationhood under the heels of a Chinese army of occupation, if it could cleanse the Glasgow slums, give a surety of food and play, the elementary right of every human being, to those people of the abyss. I realise, seated on the plump modernity of the modern Scot by the side of my investigator out on Loch Lomond Bank, how completely I am the complete Philistine. I have always liked the Philistines, a commendable and gracious and cleanly race. They built clean cities with wide, airy streets. They delighted in the singing of good, simple songs and hunting and love-making and worshipping of relevant and comprehensible gods. They were a light in the ancient Middle East, and led simple and happy and carefree lives, with a splendour of trumpets now and again to stir them to amusing orgy. And above in the hills in Jerusalem dwelt the Israelites, unwashed and unashamed, horrified at the clean anarchy, which is the essence of life, oppressed by grisly fears of life and death and time, suborning the simple human pleasures in living into an insane debating on justice and right, the good life, the soul of man, artistic canon, the first cause, national ethos, the mainsprings of conduct, aesthetic approach, and all the rest of the dirty little toys with which dirty little men and dirty little caves love to play, turning with a haughty shudder of repulsion from the cry of the wind and the beat of the sun and the hills outside. One of the greatest tragedies of the ancient world was the killing of Goliath by David, a ghoul-haunted little village squirt who sneaked up and murdered the Philistine while the latter, with a good breakfast below his belt, was admiring the sunrise. The non-Philistines never admire sunrises. They never admire good breakfasts. Their ideal is the half-starved at sunset, whose actions and appearances they can record with a proper aesthetic detachment. One of the best-loved pictures in an earlier generation of Glasgow intellectuals was Joseph Israel's frugal meal in the Glasgow galleries. Even yet, the modern will halt you to admire the chiaroscuro, the fine shades and attitudes, but you realise he is a liar. He is merely an inhibited little sadist, and his concentrated essence of enjoyment is the hunger and dirt and hopelessness of the two figures in question. He calls this a robust acceptance of life. Sometime, it is true, the non-Philistine of past days had a qualm of regret, a notion, a thin pale abortion of an idea that life in simplicity was life in essence. So he painted a man or a woman, nude only, in the less shameful portions of his or her anatomy. Egregious bushes were called in to hide the genital shames, and called it not walking, or running, or staring, or sleeping, or lusting, as it generally was, but light, or realization, or the choir, or what not. A Malay in the Glasgow galleries is an excellent example, which neither you nor my investigator may miss. It is the non-Philistine's wistful idea of, in capitals, life in simplicity, a decent young child in a breech clout about to play hoopla with a forked stick. But instead of labelling this truthfully and obviously portrait of shy Macon intellectual playing at Boy Scouts, it is called, of course, the Forerunner. The bourgeois returns at evening these days to Kelvin Grove, to Woodside Hill, to Hill Head, and Down Hall, with heavy and doubting steps. The shipyards are still rusting, cranes and unbefouled waters nearby in Springburn, the empty factories increase and multiply. There are dead windows and barred factory gates in Bridgeton and Mile End. Commercialism has returned to its own vomit too often, and too long still to find sustenance therein. Determinedly in Glasgow, as elsewhere, they call this condition the crisis, and in the fashion of a Christian Scientist whose actual need is cascara, invoke optimism for its cure. But here, as nowhere else in the modern world of capitalism, does the impartial investigator realise that the remedy lies neither in medicine nor massage, but in surgery. The doctors, he hears, are gathered for the Saturday-Sunday diagnosis on Glasgow Green, and betakes himself there accordingly. But there, as elsewhere, the physicians disagree. Multitudes of physicians, surrounded by anxious groups of the ailing patient's dependents. A brief round on the various physicians convinces the investigator of one thing, the unpopularity of surgery. The single surgeon orating is, of course, the communist. His gathering is small. A larger following attends. Mr. Guy Aldred, non-parliamentary anarcho-communist, pledged to use neither knives nor pills, but invocation of the Gospels according to St. Bakunin. Orthodox socialism, ruddy and plump with the spoils from the latest Glasgow Corporation swindle on its pockets. The feed physician, popular and pawky, is fervent and optimistic. Pills? Nonsense. Surgery? Muscovite savagery. What is needed to remove the sprouting pustules from the fair face of commercialism is merely a light, non-greasy ointment, which will not stain the sheets. Fear at hand stands the fascist, the investigator, with a training which has hitherto led him to debar the Neanderthaler from the direct ancestral line of Homo sapiens. Stares at this ethnological note of interrogation. The fascist diagnosis, lack of blood, remedy, bleeding. A nationalist holds forth nearby. What the patient needs is not more food, fresh air, a decent room of his own, and a decent soul of his own. No, what he needs is the air he ceased to breathe 250 years ago, specially reclaimed and canned by the Nationalist Party of Scotland, and forwarded in plain vans. A separatist casts scorn on the nationalist case. What the patient requires is separation from England, from English speech, English manners, English food, English clothes, English culinary, and English common sense. Then he will recover. It is coming on dark, as they say, in the Scotland that is not Glasgow, and out of the gorbles arises again that foul breath as of a dying beast. You turn from Glasgow Green with a determination to inspect this gorbles on your own. It is incredibly un-Scottish. It is lovably and abominably and delightedly and hideously un-Scottish. It is not even a Scottish slum. Stout men in beards and ringlets and unseemly attire lounge and strut with pointed shoes. Ruth and Naomi go by with downcast eastern faces. The Lascar rubbed shoulder with the Syrian. Harry Lauder is a bal unkeened to the midnight stars. In the air, the stench is of a different quality to Govern's or Camlacky's, a better quality. It is not filth and futility and boredom unrelieved. It is haunted by an ancient ghost of goodness and grossness, sun-warmed and ripened under alien suns. It is the most saving slum in Glasgow and the most abandoned. Emerging from it, the investigator suddenly realises why he sought it in such haste from Glasgow Green. It was in order that he might assure himself that there really and actually other races on the earth apart from the Scots really were. So long I have wanted to write what I am about to write, but hitherto I have lacked the excuse. Glasgow provides it. About nationalism, about small nations. What a curse to the earth are small nations. Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, San Salvador, Luxembourg, Manchukuo, the Irish Free State. There are many more. There is an appalling number of disgusting little stretches of the globe claimed occupied and infected by groupings of babbling little morons, babbling militant on the subjects unendingly, on their exclusive cultures, their exclusive languages, their national souls, their national genius, their unique achievements in throat-cutting and this and that abominable little squabble in the past. Mangy little curs, a yap. Above their minute hoardings of shrivelled bones, they cease from their yelpings at the passers-by only in such intervals as they devote to civil war flea hunts. Of all the accursed progeny of world war, surely the worst was this dwarf mongrel litter. The South Irish of the middle class were never pleasant persons, since they obtained their free state. The belch of their pride in the accents of their unhygienic patois has given the unfortunate Irish Channel the seeming of a cesspool. Having blamed their misfortunes on England for centuries, they achieved independence and promptly found themselves incapable of securing that independence by the obvious and necessary operation, social revolution. Instead, revival of a Gallic, bewildering and unhappy world with uncouth spellings and titles and postage stamps. Revival of the blood feud. Revival of the decayed literary cultus, which most product of the Celt, was an abomination even while actually alive and but poor manure when it died. Or Finland, communist murdering Finland, ruled by German generals in the Central European foundries, boasting to its ragged population the return of its ancient literary culture, like a senile octogenarian boasting the coming of second childhood. And we are bidden go and do likewise, for we are not oppressed to English influence, only at those points where it expresses itself in political domination and financial and economic over-control, but we are, or ought to be, opposed to English influence at all points. Not only must English governmental control be overthrown, but the English language must go, and English methods of education, English fashions and dress, English models in the arts, English ideals, everything English must go. This is a Mr. Ludovic Grant writing in the Free Man. Note what the Scot is bidden to give up, the English language, that lovely and flexible instrument so akin to the darker brayed Scots, which has been the Scotsman's tool of thought for 1,000 years. English methods of education, which are derived from Germano-French-Italian models. English fashions and dress, invented in Paris, London, Edinburgh, Timbuktu, Calcutta, Chichen Itza, New York. English models in the arts, nude models as well, no doubt. Scots models in future must sprout 3 pairs of arms and a navel in the likeness of a lion rampant. English ideals, decency, freedom, justice, ideals innate in the mind of a man, as common to the Bantu as to the Kentish man. Those also he must relinquish. It will profit Glasgow's 150,000 slum dwellers so much to know that they are being starved and brutalised by labour exchangers and public assistance committees, staffed exclusively by Gaelic-speaking haggis-eating Scots, in saffron kilts and tongued brogues, full of such typical Scottish ideals as those who kept men chained as slaves in the Fifeshire mines a century or so ago. Glasgow's salvation, Scotland's salvation, the world's salvation lies in neither nationalism nor internationalism, those twin halves of an idiot whole. It lies in ultimate cosmopolitanism, the earth, the city of God, the Brahmaputra and Easter Island as free and familiar to the man from Gibbon and the Molendinar and Butte. A time will come when the self-wrought, prideful differentiations of Scotsman, Englishman, Frenchman, Spaniard will seem as ludicrous as the infantile squabblings of the Heptarchians. A time will come when nationalism, with other cultural aberrations, will have passed from the human spirit, when man again, free and unchained, has all the earth for his footstool, sings his epics in a language moulded from the best on earth, draws his heroes, his sunrises, his valleys and his mountains from all the crinkles of our lovely planet, and we are bidden to abandon this vision for the delights of an archaic ape spite, a prosy barbarization. I am a nationalist only in the sense that the same Heptarchian was a Wessexman or a Mercian or whatnot, temporarily, opportunistically. I think the braid Scots may yet give lovely lights and shadows not only to English, but to the perfected speech of cosmopolitan man, so I cultivate it, for lack of that perfect speech that is yet to be. I think there's the chance that Scotland, especially in its Glasgow, in its bittering straightening of the economic struggle, may win to a freedom preparatory to and in alignment with that cosmopolitan freedom, long before England, so a cosmopolitan opportunist I am some kind of nationalist, but I'd rather any day be an expatriate writing novels in Persian about the Cape of Good Hope than a member of a homogeneous literary cultus, to quote again the cant phrase of the day, prosing eternally on one plane, the insanitary reactions, the death of a Kelvin Grove bourgeois, or the Irish gawk. It would speedily have that seeming of Ben Lomond through its clouds like a walrus through a fuff of whiskers. For this Scottish Siva herself, brandishing her many arms of smoke against the coming of the darkness, it is pleasant to remember at least one instant. On a raining night 650 years ago, a small band of men, selfless and desperate and coolly led, tramped through the winds to the assault of the English garrison Bella the Bray, which is now the steep upper part of High Street. It was a venture unsupported by priest or patrician, the intellectual or bourgeois of those days. It succeeded, and it lighted a flame of liberty throughout Scotland. Some day the surgeon leaders of the 150,000 may take that tale of Bella Bray for their text.